Margaret Chen never imagined that her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at the Riverside Public Library would lead to anything extraordinary. She was just a retired accountant who wanted to stay busy after her husband passed away 3 years ago. The library volunteer coordinator had suggested she help people with basic computer skills, and it seemed like a perfect fit. After all, she knew her way around email and video calls, and she had plenty of patience. Most days were pretty predictable. She'd help Mrs. Patterson figure out how to unmute herself on Zoom so she could see her grandchildren in Seattle. She'd show Mr. Rodriguez how to attach his resume to job applications. Sometimes she'd spend an hour helping someone reset a forgotten password. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt good to be useful again. The library itself was one of those older buildings that had been renovated just enough to stay functional. The carpet was worn in the high-traffic areas, and the wooden tables had that particular smell of old books and industrial cleaner. But it had good lighting, free Wi-Fi, and most importantly, it was warm. During the fall and winter months, Margaret noticed it wasn't just book lovers who came through the doors. It was mid-November when she first really noticed him. A young man, probably in his early 20s, always sat at the same corner table near the back. The table was tucked away behind the biography section, not quite hidden, but definitely out of the main flow of foot traffic. He'd be there when Margaret arrived at 2 o'clock, and he'd still be there when she left at 6. What caught her attention wasn't just his consistency, but what he was doing. While other people scrolled through their phones or browsed social media on the library computers, this young man was surrounded by books, not novels or magazines, but thick textbooks with titles Margaret could barely make out from a distance. Mathematics, she thought. Advanced mathematics. His appearance told a different story than his study materials. His jacket looked too thin for the weather, and he wore the same hoodie and jeans every single time she saw him. His backpack was stuffed so full it could barely zip closed, and he had this habit of making 1 cup of the library's free coffee last for hours, warming his hands on the paper cup long after it must have gone cold. Margaret had seen enough people pass through the library to recognize the signs. This wasn't a college student pulling an all-nighter before exams. This was someone who had nowhere else to go. But here's what really struck her. While others who came to the library for warmth and Wi-Fi might doze off in chairs or chat with friends, this young man was completely focused. He'd work through problems in spiral notebooks, filling page after page with numbers and symbols that looked like a foreign language to Margaret. Sometimes he'd stare at a single page in one of those textbooks for 20 minutes straight, barely blinking. Then he'd suddenly start writing frantically, like he'd just solved something important. She found herself watching him more than she probably should have. It reminded her of her late husband, Daniel. He'd been an engineering professor, and she'd seen that same kind of intense concentration when he worked on difficult problems. Daniel used to say that real problem-solving looked boring from the outside, just someone sitting and thinking, but inside their head was a whole universe of possibilities being explored. The young man never asked for help. Not with the computers, not with finding books, not with anything. He seemed to have a system. He'd work for hours, take occasional bathroom breaks, refill his coffee cup, and then return to his corner table. He never made eye contact with anyone. If someone walked too close to his table, Margaret noticed how his shoulders would tense up, and he'd pull his notebooks a little closer. Margaret wanted to approach him, to at least introduce herself, but something held her back. She'd been doing this volunteer work long enough to know that not everyone wanted to be bothered. Some people came to the library specifically because it was one of the few places where they could exist, without anyone asking questions or expecting anything from them. Still, her curiosity grew with each passing week. What was he studying? Where had he learned mathematics at that level? And most pressingly, where did he go when the library closed at 9 o'clock each night? She started paying more attention to the books he used. Most came from the library's collection, but they weren't the kind of books that got checked out often. Number theory, abstract algebra, real analysis. These were upper-level college courses, maybe even graduate school level. She knew because Daniel had taught some of these subjects, and she remembered him complaining about how difficult they were to teach. One Thursday in early December, the library was particularly crowded because of a children's reading event. The noise level was higher than usual, with kids running between the shelves and parents trying to keep them corralled. Margaret noticed the young man had his headphones on, even though she'd never seen him actually listening to music. The cord wasn't even plugged into anything. They were just a barrier, she realized, a way to signal that he didn't want to be disturbed. That same afternoon, she saw him carefully pack up his materials as closing time approached. Every movement was deliberate, making sure each book was returned to its exact spot on the shelf, each notebook packed in the right order in his backpack. It was the routine of someone who couldn't afford to lose track of anything, because replacing it wasn't an option. As he walked past her desk on his way out, Margaret almost said something. But the words caught in her throat, and then he was gone, disappearing into the cold November evening. She didn't know it then, but within a few months, this quiet young man working in the corner would change her understanding of what one person could accomplish against impossible odds, and she would play a part in changing his life in ways neither of them could have imagined. For now, though, he was just another regular patron at the Riverside Public Library. One of many who came seeking warmth, quiet, and a place to exist. Except he was also seeking something else. Knowledge, understanding, maybe even a way out. Margaret packed up her own things and headed home, already wondering if he'd be there again on Tuesday. The first week of December brought an early cold snap to Riverside. The kind of cold that made your nose hurt when you breathed in and turned your breath into little clouds. Margaret noticed the library was more crowded than usual. People who might normally spend their days elsewhere came inside to escape the bitter wind. The young man was still there at his corner table, but Margaret noticed something different. He was wearing the same thin jacket, but now he had a blanket draped over his shoulders. It was one of those emergency blankets from a shelter, the kind that crinkled when you moved. She felt her heart squeeze a little at the sight. She'd been thinking about him a lot since Thanksgiving. While she'd been at her daughter's house eating turkey and pie, where had he been? The library had been closed for 4 days. The question bothered her more than it should have. Margaret had made a decision. She was going to talk to him, even if it was awkward, even if he didn't want to be bothered. She just needed to find the right moment, the right excuse. That moment came sooner than she expected, though not in any way she would have planned. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Margaret was shelving returned books in the mathematics section. It was quiet, methodical work that she actually enjoyed. There was something satisfying about putting things back in their proper order. She had a cart full of books and was working her way down the aisle when she noticed she was near his table. She glanced over. He was deep in concentration, working through something in one of his notebooks. Around him were at least 8 or 9 books stacked in careful piles. Margaret reached up to shelve a calculus textbook on the top shelf, and that's when it happened. Her elbow caught the spine of a book she'd just placed, and it fell forward, hitting the stack of books on the cart. The whole thing created a domino effect. Books tumbled off the cart with loud thumps, and several landed right next to the young man's table. A few papers that had been tucked inside his notebooks went flying. Oh no. Oh, I'm so sorry. Margaret felt her face flush with embarrassment. She immediately crouched down to start picking up the mess she'd created. The young man looked startled, almost panicked. He jumped up and started grabbing his papers, checking each one like they were $100 bills that might blow away. I'm so sorry, Margaret repeated, picking up one of his papers that had landed near her feet. I'm just so clumsy sometimes. I didn't mean to disturb you. As she picked up the paper, she couldn't help but see what was on it. Even though she didn't understand mathematics at this level, she recognized the style. Dense equations, careful notations, logical progressions from one step to the next. It looked exactly like the kind of work Daniel used to bring home, the papers he'd spread across their dining room table while working on research projects. It's okay, the young man said quietly. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. He gently took the paper from her hand, not making eye contact. These equations, Margaret said, the words coming out before she could stop them. They look complicated. Are you studying mathematics? He hesitated, still gathering his scattered papers. Sort of. My husband was an engineering professor, Margaret continued, picking up the books from her cart. Before he passed away, he used to bring work home that looked a lot like this. I never understood it, but I always thought it was beautiful in its own way. Like music, but with numbers. The young man finally looked up at her. Really looked at her for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, and there was something guarded in them, but also something else. Surprise, maybe. Like he wasn't used to anyone noticing what he was doing, let alone commenting on it. It kind of is like music, he said slowly. When it works, anyway, Margaret smiled. I'm Margaret, by the way. I volunteer here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I've seen you here quite a bit. You're very dedicated to your studies. Another hesitation. David, my name's David. Nice to meet you properly, David. Margaret finished picking up the last of the fallen books. I really am sorry about startling you. It's fine, David said, and this time he almost smiled. Almost. That could have been the end of it. A brief, polite interaction between a volunteer and a patron. But something in Margaret wouldn't let her walk away quite yet. David, I don't mean to pry, but when's the last time you ate something? I usually bring extra lunch on Thursdays, and I have half a sandwich I'm not going to finish. Turkey and Swiss. Would you like it? His face went carefully blank. I'm fine, thank you. Of course, Margaret said quickly. I just thought I'd offer. It's just going to go to waste otherwise. She returned to her shelving, but she did leave the sandwich, wrapped in plastic, on the information desk with a small note that said, for anyone who's hungry. Within an hour, it was gone. She didn't see David take it, but she noticed him looking less hunched over later that afternoon. The next Tuesday, Margaret brought an extra sandwich again. This time, she accidentally left it on a chair near David's table while she was shelving nearby. The pattern continued over the next few weeks. Sometimes it was a sandwich. Sometimes it was crackers and cheese. Once it was a container of her homemade soup in a disposable cup. David never thanked her directly, but he stopped tensing up quite so much when she walked past his table. And occasionally when she'd say hello or how's the studying going, he'd respond with a few words instead of just a nod. Slowly, piece by piece, Margaret began to learn his story. Not because she interrogated him, but because tiny details would slip out during their brief exchanges. He was 23. He'd grown up in foster care. He'd managed to get a scholarship to community college 2 years ago, studying mathematics because it was the one thing that had always made sense to him. But then there'd been problems with housing. The details were vague, but Margaret read between the lines. He'd lost his place to live, couldn't afford to stay in school, and had been trying to figure things out ever since. So you're teaching yourself? Margaret asked one day in mid-December, genuinely curious. The library has good books, David said simply, and the internet. You can learn anything if you know where to look. But isn't it hard without a teacher? Without someone to check your work? David shrugged. It's harder, but math is math. If your proof works, it works. If it doesn't, you keep trying. Margaret thought about that a lot over the following days. Here was someone with obvious talent and dedication, someone who was working at a level that most people would need years of formal education to reach, and he was doing it alone in a corner of a public library, because he had nowhere else to go, because the system had somehow failed to catch him, or maybe he'd fallen through one of its many cracks. She started asking careful questions about the library's closing procedures. What happened to people who were still inside when they had to lock up? Where did the homeless shelters in town have space? What resources existed for young people aging out of foster care? The answers weren't encouraging. The shelters were often full. The resources were stretched thin, and young men in particular seemed to fall through the gaps in social services. Margaret began to understand something. David wasn't just at the library to study. The library was his stability, his routine, his safe place in a life that probably felt very uncertain, and she'd stumbled into his world by accident, by knocking over a cart of books. Sometimes, she thought, the most important things happen in the most ordinary ways. By early January, Margaret and David had developed something that almost resembled a friendship. Or maybe it was more accurate to say that David had started to trust her enough to let his guard down occasionally. Their conversations were still brief, but they happened more naturally now. She learned that he'd been good at math since elementary school. Not just good, but the kind of good where teachers would give him extra worksheets because he'd finish regular classwork in half the time as everyone else. In one foster home, he'd had a foster parent who'd been a retired high school math teacher. That was the closest thing to real encouragement he'd ever gotten. She told me I had a gift, David said one afternoon. It was one of the longer conversations they'd had. She said I shouldn't waste it. But then I got moved to a different home, and that was that. Margaret noticed he said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, like it was just one of many disappointments he'd learned to accept. The library had announced it would be closed for 3 days at the end of January for some kind of maintenance work. Margaret had been worrying about this since she'd seen the notice. 3 days in the middle of winter with no library meant 3 days David would have nowhere to spend his daylight hours. On the last day before the closure, she made sure to tell him about it. "I know you probably saw the signs, but just in case. We'll be closed Friday through Sunday." "I saw," David said. "Thanks. Do you have somewhere you can go?" "Just to stay warm, I mean." She tried to keep her voice casual, not pitying. "I'll figure it out. I always do." That answer didn't satisfy her, but she didn't push. She'd learned that David valued his independence even when accepting help might have been the smarter choice. The library closed on Thursday evening, and Margaret went home feeling unsettled. She spent Friday running errands and trying not to think about where David might be. On Saturday, her daughter called and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Sunday, she went to church and had lunch with a friend from her book club. Normal weekend activities. But her mind kept wandering to that corner table at the library. When the library reopened on Monday, Margaret got there a bit earlier than usual. She was relieved to see David already in his spot. But something was different. He looked exhausted. Not just tired, but worn down in a way she hadn't seen before. And more concerning, he wasn't working. He was just sitting there staring at an open notebook, not writing anything. Margaret gave him space at first. She helped a few patrons with their computer questions and organized some returned books. But she kept glancing over at his table. By 4 o'clock, he still hadn't written a single thing. He was just sitting there, and she could see the frustration radiating off him. She decided to take a chance. She walked over to his table with 2 cups of hot coffee from the library's machine. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" she asked. "My feet are killing me." David looked up, seeming to notice her for the first time. "Sure." She sat down across from him and slid one of the coffee cups in his direction. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret had learned that sometimes silence was okay. "Bad weekend?" she finally asked. David let out a long breath. "Yeah, you could say that. Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head, but then, surprisingly, he started talking anyway. "The shelter I usually stay at was full all 3 nights. I ended up sleeping at the bus station. Security there doesn't hassle you too much if you keep moving around, but it's loud and bright and you can't really sleep. By the 3rd night, I was so tired I couldn't think straight." Margaret's heart ached. "That sounds really difficult." "I'm used to difficult," David said. "That's not the problem." He gestured at his notebook with something close to anger. "The problem is I was so close. I've been working on this problem for months. It's from a paper I found in an old academic journal someone donated to the library. The journal said this problem had been unsolved for years, and when I read it, I thought maybe I could figure it out. And I did. Or I thought I did." "What kind of problem?" Margaret asked. "It's called number theory. It's about the relationships between numbers, patterns that exist in mathematics. This particular problem, it's been stumped mathematicians for over a decade." He ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "I spent 3 months working through it. I filled 2 entire notebooks with work. And last week I finished. I had a complete proof. I checked it over and over and I couldn't find any mistakes." "That sounds amazing," Margaret said carefully. "Except what's the point?" David's voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself and lowered it again. "I have no one to show it to. No one to verify if it's actually correct or if I'm just fooling myself. I can't submit it to a journal because I'm not affiliated with any university. I don't even have an email address that sounds legitimate. I'm just some homeless guy who thinks he solved something smart people couldn't figure out." "Who's going to believe that?" He slumped back in his chair, and Margaret could see how defeated he felt. This wasn't just about 3 bad nights at a bus station. This was about feeling trapped, about having talent and nowhere to use it. Margaret sat with that for a moment. She thought about Daniel, about his colleagues at the university. Most had retired by now, but there was one, Robert Ashford. He'd been at Daniel's memorial service. He'd told her to call if she ever needed anything. At the time, she'd thought it was just something people said. One of those polite offers that no one expects you to take seriously. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was exactly the kind of offer that was meant for moments like this. "David," she said slowly, "what if I knew someone who could look at your work? A real mathematician, I mean, a professor." David looked at her skeptically. "You know a mathematician?" "My husband's old colleague. He still teaches at the state university. He's a good person. If I asked him to look at your work as a favor, I think he would. Why would you do that? David asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question. Because you deserve a chance, Margaret said simply. Because you've been working harder than most college students I've ever seen, and you're doing it under circumstances that would make most people give up. And because my husband would have wanted me to help if I could. He believed in recognizing talent, especially when it came from unexpected places. David was quiet for a long moment. What if it's all wrong? What if I show it to a real professor and it turns out I've been wasting my time? Then at least you'll know, Margaret said gently. And you can learn from it and try something else. But what if you're right? What if you actually did solve it? Don't you want to know for sure? She could see him wrestling with it. Hope was a scary thing when you'd been disappointed too many times. It was safer not to hope at all. Okay, he finally said. Okay, but I don't want to get my hopes up. This is probably nothing. That's fine, Margaret said. No expectations. We'll just see what happens. She pulled out her phone.
Can I take pictures of your work?
I'll send them to Professor Ashford tonight. David carefully opened his notebook, showing pages filled with dense mathematical notation. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, each symbol precisely formed. Margaret took photos of page after page, making sure the lighting was good and everything was legible. This might take him a few days to look at, she warned. Professors are busy people. I've waited this long, David said. A few more days won't matter. But Margaret could see something had shifted in him. There was a spark there that hadn't been present when she'd first sat down. Not quite hope, but maybe something close to it. Possibility. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table composing an email to Robert Ashford. She tried to strike the right tone, not too desperate, but conveying that this was important. She explained about David, about his circumstances, about the work he'd been doing. She attached the photos and pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Then she waited. And hoped that she hadn't just set David up for another disappointment in a life that had already had too many. Margaret didn't tell David when to expect a response. She'd said a few days, maybe a week. Professors were busy, and she had no idea if Robert Ashford would even look at the photos right away. For all she knew, her email would sit in his inbox for 2 weeks before he got around to it. She checked her email obsessively that first night. Nothing. The next morning, still nothing. She went to the library for her Tuesday shift, trying to manage her own expectations. She smiled at David when she arrived, gave him a little wave, but didn't go over to his table. She didn't want to make him more anxious than he probably already was. David, for his part, seemed to be trying to act normal. He had his textbooks open, his notebooks out, but Margaret noticed he wasn't really working. He was going through the motions, turning pages, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. It was late Tuesday afternoon, almost time for Margaret to head home when her phone buzzed. An email from Robert Ashford. Her heart jumped. She opened it immediately, right there at the information desk. Margaret, it read. I apologize for the delayed response. I've been in meetings all day and just now had a chance to look at the photographs you sent. I need to see more of this work. When can we meet? I'm free tomorrow morning if that's possible. This is important. Please call me. His phone number was at the bottom of the email. Margaret read it 3 times, trying to understand the tone. He sounded urgent. But was that good urgent or bad urgent? She couldn't tell. She looked across the library at David. He was packing up his things, getting ready to leave before closing time. She had to tell him, but she didn't want to do it here, not where other people might overhear. David, she called softly as he walked past the information desk. Do you have a minute? He stopped, and she could see the question in his eyes. Did he respond? He did. Let's talk outside? They walked out into the cold January evening together. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered around. Margaret's breath made little clouds in the air as she tried to figure out how to say this. He looked at your work, she started. He wants to meet with you. Tomorrow morning, if possible. David's face went through several expressions at once. Hope, fear, suspicion. What did he say about it? Did he say if it was right? He didn't say specifically, just that he needs to see more. That it's important. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed him the email. David read it, his lips moving slightly as he took in each word. Important. What does that mean? I think it means he saw something worth investigating further, Margaret said carefully. But we won't know for sure until you two talk. Are you willing to meet with him? Tomorrow morning? David looked down at himself, at his worn jacket and faded jeans. I don't exactly look like someone a professor would take seriously. Robert knew my husband for 30 years, Margaret said firmly. He's not the kind of person who judges people by their clothes. He cares about ideas, about mathematics. That's all. Where would we meet? Probably at the library, if that's okay with you. Neutral ground. I'll be there too if you want me to be. David nodded slowly. Yeah, okay. What time? Margaret called Professor Ashford right then, stepping a few feet away to make the arrangements. 10 o'clock at the library. He'd be there. That night Margaret barely slept. She kept running through scenarios in her head. What if David's work was brilliant and this changed his whole life? What if there were mistakes and he had to face that disappointment? What if the professor was kind about it? What if he wasn't? She got to the library at 9:30 the next morning, even though it didn't open until 10. David was already there, waiting by the front doors. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Morning, she said gently. Morning. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets. I'm nervous. That's completely normal. I'm nervous too, and I'm not even the one being evaluated. The library director let them in early and gave them permission to use one of the small meeting rooms. It had a table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard on one wall. Margaret made coffee, mostly to have something to do with her hands. Professor Robert Ashford arrived at exactly 10 o'clock. He was in his late 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a button-down shirt and khakis under his winter coat, looking every bit the academic he was. He carried a leather messenger bag stuffed with papers. Margaret, he said warmly, giving her a hug. It's good to see you. It's been too long. Robert, thank you so much for coming. This is David Nguyen. David, this is Professor Robert Ashford. The two men shook hands. Margaret could see David was trying hard not to show how nervous he was. Let's sit, Professor Ashford said. David, Margaret sent me photographs of your work. I have to tell you, I stayed up until 2 in the morning last night going through them. David's eyes widened. You did? I did, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you've done here, it's not just good. If it's correct, and I believe it is, it's extraordinary. You've solved a problem that has been frustrating number theorists for 12 years. The room went very quiet. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. I don't understand, David said slowly. Are you saying it's right? I'm saying I need to verify every step, which will take time. But from what I've seen so far, your logic is sound. More than sound, it's elegant. You've approached this problem in a way that no one else thought to try. Professor Ashford pulled out a folder from his bag. I brought a copy of the original paper, the one that first posed this problem. Have you seen it? Yeah, David said. I found it in an old journal someone donated to the library. I read it maybe 6 months ago. And you decided to just try to solve it? There was wonder in the professor's voice. I didn't think I could at first, but I kept thinking about it, and then I had an idea, and then another idea, and it sort of snowballed from there. David was speaking faster now, more animated than Margaret had ever seen him. See, everyone was trying to approach it through this one method. But I thought maybe if you looked at it from a different angle, using these other principles, it might work. Show me, Professor Ashford said, pulling out the photographs Margaret had sent him. Walk me through your thinking. For the next 2 hours, Margaret watched something remarkable happen. David transformed. The quiet, guarded young man she'd gotten to know became confident, articulate, passionate. He filled the whiteboard with equations, explaining his reasoning step by step. Professor Ashford asked questions, challenging certain steps, and David responded with detailed explanations. Margaret understood maybe 1 word in 10, but she didn't need to understand the mathematics to see what was happening. This was David's language, his element. This was what he was meant to do. Remarkable, Professor Ashford kept saying. Truly remarkable. Finally, they took a break. David's hand was cramped from writing on the whiteboard, and they were all ready for more coffee. David, Professor Ashford said as they sat back down, I need to ask you some questions about your situation. Margaret told me some of it, but I'd like to hear it from you. Where are you living? What's your educational background? David's walls went back up a little. I'm in between places right now. I stay at a shelter when there's room, sometimes other places, and I went to community college for 1.5 years on a scholarship. Then I had to drop out. Why did you have to drop out? Housing issues. Financial issues. The usual stuff. David shrugged like it didn't matter, but Margaret could see it did. Professor Ashford leaned forward. Here's what I'd like to propose. I want to present your work to the mathematics department at the university. I want to verify it fully, get other experts to review it, and if everything checks out the way I think it will, we need to publish this. But more importantly, we need to get you back in school. You belong in graduate school, David? You belong in a PhD program? David looked stunned. I can't afford graduate school. Graduate students in mathematics get fellowships, full tuition plus a stipend to live on. You wouldn't pay anything. They'd pay you. Professor Ashford smiled. And I can help with the application process. I can make some calls, but first we need to deal with your immediate situation. Do you have somewhere stable to stay? Not really. Okay, we're going to fix that today. The professor pulled out his phone. I know people who run a program for students in transition. Let me make some calls. Margaret watched David's face. He looked overwhelmed, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. She reached over and squeezed his hand. It's real, she said softly. This is really happening. David's eyes were shiny. I thought I was going crazy. Working on this problem by myself with no one to check it? I thought maybe I'd just convinced myself it was right when it wasn't. You weren't crazy, Professor Ashford said firmly. You were brilliant. You are brilliant, and we're going to make sure the world knows it. The next few weeks moved so fast that David sometimes felt like he was watching it happen to someone else. Professor Ashford worked quickly, making phone calls and pulling strings in ways that David didn't fully understand but was deeply grateful for. Within 3 days, David had a room in a transitional housing program specifically designed for students. It was small, just a bed, a desk, and a shared bathroom down the hall. But it was warm and safe and his. He had a key, a real key to a real door that locked. The first night there, he just sat on the bed for an hour, trying to absorb the fact that he didn't have to leave. Professor Ashford connected him with the university's emergency aid office, and they helped him get a phone. An actual smartphone with a data plan. David had been surviving with a prepaid flip phone that he could barely afford to keep minutes on. Now he had email, a real email address that ended in the university's domain. But the most important thing happening was the verification of his work. Professor Ashford assembled a small team of mathematicians to review David's proof. They met twice a week in a conference room at the university, going through every line, every step, every assumption. David was terrified at these meetings at first. These were real professors, people with PhDs and published papers and decades of experience. Who was he to sit at the same table with them? But they treated him like a colleague. They asked questions not to trip him up, but because they were genuinely curious about his thinking. When they found a small gap in his reasoning, they worked with him to fill it in. When they confirmed a particularly clever part of his proof, they told him so. This section here, one professor said during the third meeting, pointing at a series of equations. This is really innovative. I've never seen this approach before. David felt himself sit up a little straighter. I wasn't sure if it was allowed, actually. I couldn't find any examples of it in the textbooks. It's allowed because it works, the professor said with a smile. That's what matters. Sometimes the best mathematics comes from not knowing you're not supposed to do something a certain way. After 6 weeks of intensive review, the team reached their conclusion. David's proof was correct. Not just correct, but genuinely significant. He had solved an open problem that had stumped mathematicians for over a decade, and he'd done it with methods that opened up new possibilities for tackling similar problems. We need to publish this, Professor Ashford told him. I've already reached out to several journals. Based on the significance of the result, I think we can get it into a top-tier publication. What do I need to do? David asked. Write it up properly. Academic papers have a certain format, certain ways of presenting results. I'll help you with that. It'll take time to get it right, but we'll get there. They spent the next month working on the paper together. David learned how to write mathematics for an academic audience, how to present his ideas clearly and formally. He learned about citations and references and all the little details that went into a publishable paper. Meanwhile, Professor Ashford was working on something else. He was putting together an application package for David to enter graduate school in the fall. Letters of recommendation, transcripts from his community college days, and most importantly, the paper itself as evidence of David's abilities. The applications are normally due in December for fall admission, Professor Ashford explained. But given your circumstances, I've talked to the Graduate Admissions Committee. They're willing to make an exception. In March, David received an acceptance letter from the university's mathematics PhD program, full fellowship, full tuition coverage, a stipend of $28,000 a year to live on. Health insurance included. He read the letter 3 times, then called Margaret. She was the first person he wanted to tell. I got in, he said when she answered. Full funding, everything. He could hear the smile in her voice. David, that's wonderful. I knew you would. I'm so proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you. You know that, right? If you hadn't knocked over those books, if you hadn't reached out to Professor Ashford, none of this would have happened. You did the hard part, Margaret said gently. You did the work. You taught yourself advanced mathematics in a library with no teacher, no support, nothing but your own determination. All I did was make a phone call. It was more than that, David said. You were the first person in a long time who treated me like I mattered. Like what I was doing was worth paying attention to. That meant everything. The paper was published in May in the Journal of Number Theory, one of the most respected publications in the field. The title was A Novel Approach to the Modified Erdos Conjecture, with David Nguyen listed as the sole author. Professor Ashford had insisted on that even though he'd helped with the writing. This is your work, he'd said firmly. I was just an editor. You get the credit. The publication created a small stir in the mathematics community, not because the proof itself was controversial, but because of who had written it. A 23-year-old with no formal degree beyond community college, who had been homeless while doing the work. It was the kind of story that people paid attention to. A local newspaper picked it up first. Then a regional news station. Before long, David was being asked to do interviews. He hated the attention at first, uncomfortable with talking about his homelessness, his foster care background. It felt like those things were being used to make the story more dramatic, but Margaret helped him see it differently. Your story matters, she told him over coffee one afternoon. They were at a real coffee shop now, not just drinking the free stuff at the library. David could afford to buy coffee. It still felt strange, not because it's dramatic, but because it shows that talent exists everywhere. How many other kids are out there right now, smart and capable but trapped by circumstances? Maybe your story helps people see that. Maybe it changes something. The local news coverage led to something unexpected. The library board voted to create a new program. They called it the Daniel Chen Memorial Scholarship, named after Margaret's late husband. It would provide funding for tutoring, internet access, and educational materials for homeless youth and students in transition. Margaret cried when they told her. David was there when they announced it, and he put his arm around her shoulders while she wiped her eyes. Daniel would have loved this, she said. He always said education was the great equalizer. He would have loved what you've accomplished, David. I wish I could have met him, David said. He would have liked you. He would have recognized your potential immediately. In August, David started his graduate program. He moved into student housing, nothing fancy but clean and safe. He had an office he shared with other graduate students. He had an advisor, colleagues, seminars to attend. He was officially a mathematician, but he didn't forget where he came from. Twice a week he volunteered at the library, helping people with math questions and working with participants in the new scholarship program. He knew what it was like to try to learn on your own, and he wanted to make it easier for others. Margaret still volunteered at the library too. They'd sometimes cross paths on Tuesday afternoons, and they'd catch up over coffee afterward. She told him about her grandchildren, her book club, her garden. He told her about his classes, his research, the paper he was working on for his advisor. One Tuesday in October, almost a year after she'd first really noticed him at that corner table, David had news. I've been invited to give a talk, he said, at the National Mathematics Conference in December, about my proof. David, that's incredible. Those conferences are a big deal, aren't they? Yeah, it's where all the top mathematicians present their work. I'm going to be so nervous, he smiled. Would you come? To the talk, I mean. I know it's probably boring if you don't understand the math, but I'd really like you to be there. Margaret felt her eyes water. I would be honored. The conference was in Boston, and Margaret flew out for it. She sat in the back of the auditorium and watched David, in a borrowed suit that Professor Ashford had helped him pick out, present his work to a room full of distinguished mathematicians. He was still nervous, she could tell, but he was also confident. He knew his material. He belonged there. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Several people stood up. Margaret stood too, tears running down her face, clapping until her hands hurt. Afterward, at the reception, David introduced her to everyone as the person who changed my life. She met mathematicians from universities all over the world, all of them impressed by David's work, all of them curious about his story. One older professor from MIT pulled Margaret aside. "What you did for that young man," he said, "recognizing his potential, helping him when he needed it most, that's the kind of thing that reminds me why I went into education in the first place. You should be very proud." "He did all the hard work," Margaret said, echoing what she'd told David so many times. "I just made a phone call." "Don't underestimate the power of one person who cares," the professor said. "The world has plenty of talent. What it often lacks is someone willing to notice, to believe, to help. You were that person for him." Later, Margaret and David walked through Boston Common as snow started to fall. It was cold, but Margaret didn't mind. David was telling her about his plans for the future, the research he wanted to do, the problems he wanted to tackle. "I want to start a mentorship program," he said, "for kids in foster care who are interested in math and science, so they don't have to figure everything out alone like I did." "That sounds wonderful," Margaret said. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the snow dust the bare tree branches. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "Why did you help me?" "I was just some random person at the library. You didn't know anything about me." Margaret thought about it. "I saw someone working hard," she said finally. "Someone who clearly cared about what they were doing. And I saw an opportunity to help, so I did. That's all. Sometimes it really is that simple." "Well," David said, "I'm glad you knocked over that cart of books." Margaret laughed. "Me too. Though at the time I was mortified." "Best accident that ever happened," David said. They stood there in the falling snow, an unlikely pair brought together by chance and mathematics and the simple act of one person noticing another. The future stretched out ahead of them both, full of possibilities that neither could have imagined a year ago. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the most important things we do are the small things. A phone call, a sandwich left on a table, a conversation started because of some dropped books. We never know which small moment might change everything, but if we stay open, stay kind, stay willing to see people for who they really are and what they might become, those moments find us. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to watch someone's life transform because we bothered to care. That, Margaret decided, was a pretty good way to live.